There's a strange moment that happens to almost everyone, but few stop to observe it. You wake up, you grab your phone, you read the news, you reply to messages, you drink your coffee while your mind is already 3 hours ahead, organizing your day, anticipating problems, rehearsing conversations that may never happen. You drive to work, you complete tasks, you make decisions, you interact with people, you feel emotions, you think about the future, you go home. And at no point, not even for a second, do you question whether you are truly conscious, because you are awake, you are thinking, you are feeling. Of course you are conscious, but what if you are not? What if what you call consciousness is just the most basic level of perception possible? A primitive operating system running in the back of your mind, as automatic as breathing, as invisible as air? What if the feeling of being in control, of being present, of being alive, is precisely the evidence that you never left autopilot? There is something deeply unsettling about this possibility. It's not about being asleep in the literal sense. It's about living a whole life thinking you're seeing everything, when in fact you're looking through a crack. It's about confusing the first step with the top of the stairs. The truth is that consciousness is not binary. It is not on or off. It is not awake or asleep. Consciousness has layers, levels, stages of depth that most people never touch. Not because they are inaccessible, but because they never suspected they existed. And here's the blind spot. The more you feel in control of your life, the more likely you are operating at the most primitive level. Because the higher stages of consciousness don't reveal themselves through control. They reveal themselves through the dissolution of it. Think about how many times you felt like you were living on autopilot. How many times you've driven miles without remembering the route. How many times you've had an entire conversation while your mind was elsewhere. How many times you've reacted with anger, fear, or desire without choosing to react. It just happened, as if something inside you had pressed a button. These are not lapses. These are glimpses. Moments when the veil is thin enough for you to realize that something is controlling you, and it's not exactly you. Most of humanity lives within a single level of consciousness, a level designed for one thing, survival. And while this system has kept the species alive for millions of years, it was never meant to generate peace, clarity, or freedom. It was meant to react, to fear, to seek, to never ever stop. What happens is that this level of consciousness is so dominant, so persuasive, that it becomes transparent. You don't see it, you see through it. It becomes the lens through which all reality is filtered. And you never stop to ask, what if this lens is distorting everything? But there are other levels. Levels where fear loses its urgency, where desire no longer dictates every choice, where the line between you and the world begins to blur. Levels where the mind stops telling compulsive stories about who you are, what you need, and why nothing ever seems to be enough. And when you realize that these levels exist, when you understand that what you called mindfulness was just the first floor of a much larger structure, everything changes. Not because you become someone else, but because you finally see the prison you've always been in. The question then is not whether you are conscious. The question is, at what level are you operating now? And have you realized that you are trapped? Because most people never realize it. And that is precisely the trap. So here is the truth that no one has told you. Consciousness evolves. It expands. And there are 6 main levels through which a human being can transition. But the vast majority never leave the first. Not because of a lack of ability, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because the first level is so good at disguising itself as complete reality that you never suspect there is more. And now that you know this, can you go back to not knowing? The first level of consciousness doesn't seem primitive when you're inside it. In fact, it seems to be the only possible reality. Think about how you feel when you're late for an important appointment. Your heart races, your jaw locks. Every red light seems like a personal conspiracy against you. Your mind races. If I'm late, they'll think I'm irresponsible. I might miss this opportunity. This will ruin everything. And in the midst of it all, there's a visceral, almost physical sense that your survival depends on arriving on time. But it doesn't. You're not going to die because you're 10 minutes late. No one is going to attack you. No predator is chasing you. And yet your body reacts as if it were. This is survival consciousness, the first level. The oldest operating system of the human mind, it designed millions of years ago when delays really did mean death. When every shadow could be a predator, when every strange noise demanded an instant reaction. This system kept the species alive, but it was never turned off. The problem is that this level of consciousness does not distinguish between real and imagined threats. It does not know the difference between I'm being chased by a lion and my boss might get angry with me. For the limbic brain, the most primitive structure of your nervous system, both are deadly dangers, and it acts accordingly. Every time you feel that tightness in your chest when you see an unexpected notification. Every time you avoid a difficult conversation because it's not the right time. Every time you buy something you don't need just because it was on sale. Every time you accept an invitation you don't want just so you don't disappoint someone. You are not making conscious choices. You are reacting from your survival system. And what's most disturbing, you believe that these reactions are you, that it's the way you are, that you are anxious by nature or have always been this way. But it's not you. It's the system running. There is a 19th century thinker named Søren Kierkegaard who described something he called unconscious despair. He said that the worst form of human suffering is not the one you recognize. It's the one you don't even realize you're feeling. It's living in a state of permanent tension, of endless searching, of sneaky fear, and thinking that's normal. To think that this is what life is like. This is exactly what happens at the first level of consciousness. You're in despair, but you don't even know it, because despair has become the constant backdrop of your experience. It has become the air you breathe, and when something is constant enough, you stop noticing it. Look at the way most people live. They wake up tired, already worried about what needs to be done. They spend their days managing urgencies, real or imagined. They check their cell phones dozens of times as if something catastrophic might be waiting there. They accumulate things they don't need. They pursue status that doesn't satisfy them. They avoid silence because silence makes anxiety more audible. And when you ask why, the answer is always some variation of, because I need to. I need to secure my future. I need to be successful. I need people to respect me. I need to be safe. But safe from what? The question is never asked to its conclusion. Because if it were, the answer would be disturbing. You don't know. There's just a vague feeling that something bad will happen if you stop running. And that feeling is enough to keep you moving. That's the trick of the first level. It turns everything into a matter of survival. Not just food, shelter, and physical safety, but social approval, professional success, identity, control over the future. Everything becomes life or death. And when everything is urgent, nothing can be questioned. Have you noticed how people talk about their lives? I'm racing against time. I can't afford to make mistakes. I have to prove I'm capable. I need to make sure nothing gets out of control. This language isn't metaphorical. It reveals the system at work. It reveals the dominant level of consciousness. And the most tragic thing is that it works. It works well enough that you never suspect there is another way to live. You accomplish things. You solve problems. You maintain relationships. You pay the bills. You survive another day. And in the end, when your head hits the pillow, there's a dull exhaustion. Not of the body, but of the mind that never stopped calculating threats. But here's what no one tells you. This system never rests. Because it wasn't made to rest. It was made to keep you alive in a world where every day was a battle for survival. And it's still operating as if you were in that world. Except you're not. The tiger is no longer in the forest. But the alarm keeps ringing. And while it rings, you can't access anything beyond it. You can't feel genuine peace because peace is interpreted as vulnerability. You can't be truly present because the system is always 3 steps ahead, anticipating the next danger. You can't fully trust anything. Not people, not the future, not yourself. Because trust, at that level, seems like suicidal naivety. There is an image that illustrates this perfectly. Imagine you are driving a car, but the only instruments on the dashboard are a broken speedometer, a fuel alarm that never turns off, and a rear-view mirror that only shows accidents that happened years ago. You are not driving based on what is in front of you. You are driving based on ghosts, false alarms, and gauges that have lost touch with reality. And yet you accelerate, because stopping seems more dangerous than continuing. Most people live and die here, and never realize it. Because this level of consciousness is convincing. It delivers results. It keeps you functioning. And functioning, for many, is confused with living. Think about the small, everyday catastrophes that seem to justify this constant urgency. An unanswered email becomes a reason for insomnia. A late bill becomes evidence of imminent collapse. An ambiguous comment from someone becomes proof of total rejection. The survival system takes these details and amplifies them until they seem like matters of life and death. And you obey. Not because you choose to, but because your body has already responded before your mind has a chance to evaluate. Cortisol has already been released. Your heart has already raced. Your breathing has already become shallow. The decision has already been made by a part of you that acts faster than thought. That's the dirty secret of the first level. You're not in control. You think you are. But in fact, you are being controlled by a system designed for a world that no longer exists. And the final irony, the more you try to control, the more evidence you give that you are trapped. Because control at this level is just fear disguised as efficiency. But what about when this system is guaranteed? When you have food, shelter, physical safety, when your basic survival needs are met, what happens? The answer should be freedom. It should be expansion. It should be the opportunity to finally relax and explore deeper levels of consciousness. But that's not what happens, because the system wasn't programmed to shut down. It just changes its target. When physical survival is taken care of, the mind doesn't rest. It finds new enemies. And this time, they're not out there. They are inside. Imagine someone who has everything that should bring security: a stable job, a solid relationship, good health, no real threats in sight. And yet they wake up in the middle of the night with a tight chest thinking, what if she leaves me? What if I'm not enough? What if it all falls apart? There is no tiger. There is no predator. But the fear remains. And now it feeds on ghosts. This is the second level of consciousness, emotional consciousness. Here, the survival system does not disappear. It becomes more sophisticated. It stops reacting only to physical threats and begins to react to psychological threats: rejection, abandonment, failure, humiliation, loss of identity. And the problem is that these threats are endless because they don't exist in the real world. They exist in your head, in the way you interpret a look, a silence, an unanswered message, a subtle criticism. Everything becomes fuel for fear. The curious thing is that this level seems more evolved than the first. After all, you're not just trying to survive physically. You're dealing with emotional nuances, the complexity of relationships, the construction of an identity. It seems like progress, but in practice it's just a more elaborate version of the same prison. Here, every interaction becomes a minefield. You don't just hear what the person says, you hear what they meant. You don't just feel the present, you feel the echo of every time something similar has happened before. Your mind isn't on the conversation. It's rummaging through memories, looking for patterns, trying to predict betrayals before they happen. And that's not paranoia. It's your brain doing the job it was trained to do: protect you. The problem is that now the danger isn't physical, it's emotional. And emotions don't obey logic, they obey memory. Have you ever noticed how certain feelings come out of nowhere? Someone makes a neutral comment and you feel a pang of inadequacy. Someone doesn't reply to a message and you immediately imagine you've been rejected. Someone compliments you and you immediately suspect their intentions. This isn't about the present, it's about all the times you've been hurt before. Buddhism calls this samskaras, mental impressions left by past experiences. Every unhealed wound becomes a permanent filter, and little by little, you stop seeing people as they are. You only see the ghosts of what they could do to you. And then something paradoxical happens. The more you seek emotional security, the more insecure you become. Because emotional security at this level depends on controlling the uncontrollable. It depends on ensuring that no one will disappoint you, that you will never fail, that you will always be loved, respected, validated. But no one can guarantee that. And the attempt to guarantee it generates exactly the opposite. Suffocating relationships, constant fear of loss, desperate need for approval. You begin to mold your personality according to what you think others expect. You hide parts of yourself that seem too much or too little. You avoid conflict because conflict seems threatening. You seek external validation because internal validation never seems enough. And deep down, very deep down, there is a question you never ask out loud. Who would I be if no one was watching? You don't know, because at the second level of consciousness, the I is a construct made up of emotional responses. It is the sum of all the times you were accepted or rejected, all the times you felt safe or threatened, all the stories you've told yourself to make sense of the pain. But here's the most unsettling part. This level also masquerades as normality, because pretty much everyone lives here. Everyone is looking for validation. Everyone has unhealed wounds dictating their reactions. Everyone interprets silences, imagines rejections, projects fears. That's why relationships are so difficult. Not because people are bad, but because most are operating from the second level, where every interaction is filtered through unresolved trauma, where every gesture is loaded with emotional meaning, where no one is really present because everyone is trying to protect themselves from ghosts. There is a scene that illustrates this perfectly. Two people talking in a cafe. On the surface, everything seems normal. But if you could see what is happening inside each of them, you would see two parallel realities. One is listening to the words but interpreting rejection. The other is talking but monitoring every reaction for signs of disapproval. Neither of them is really present. Both are engaged in silent combat against threats that only exist in memory. And worse, you think you know yourself. You think your emotions are yours, that your anger is justified, that your fear makes sense, that your sadness has a clear cause. But in fact, you are just reacting to memories. reacting to patterns, reacting to a system that learned long ago that the emotional world is dangerous and that you must always be on guard. This is the labyrinth. You enter thinking you are protecting yourself. But the more you protect yourself, the more walls you build. And the more walls you build, the more alone you become. Until one day you realize the prison is not outside. You carry it within you. And then an inevitable question arises. Is there a way out? Is it possible to live without every emotion being an alarm? Without every interaction being a threat? Without every silence being interpreted as rejection? The answer is yes. But the way out is not where most people look. It is not in better controlling your emotions. It is not in finding the perfect relationship. It is not in becoming stronger or more resilient. The way out is in realizing that you are not your emotions, that there is something in you that can observe them without being swept away by them, something that does not react, something that simply sees. But to get there, you need to walk through a door that most people avoid, because on the other side of that door, the mind finds a powerful but also dangerous tool, a tool that promises liberation, but can become the most subtle of prisons. There is a strange moment in many people's lives, a moment when they look back and realize, I used to feel everything so intensely, and now I just think. It seems like progress. It seems like maturity. No longer being dominated by emotions, being able to analyze situations clearly, making decisions based on logic rather than impulse. That should be freedom. And for a while it is. This is the third level of consciousness, intellectual consciousness. Here for the first time, there is a clear separation between the observer and the observed. You are no longer just your emotions. You can see them from the outside. You don't react automatically. You reflect, ponder, choose. The mind finally gains some control over the internal chaos. It's a real leap, a genuine breakthrough. But it is also the beginning of a much more subtle trap. Because when the mind discovers that it can think about life instead of just living it, something seductive happens. It begins to believe that thinking is enough, that understanding is the same as experiencing, that knowledge is the same as wisdom. And little by little, reason ceases to be a tool and becomes a fortress. Think of someone who has spent years working on themselves. They have read dozens of books on psychology, philosophy, and self-knowledge. They understand their emotional patterns perfectly. They can name their wounds. They can explain precisely why they act in certain ways in specific situations. This person has a detailed map of their own mind. And yet, they continue to repeat the same patterns. Because understanding is not the same as transcending. Knowing the prison is not the same as getting out of it. But the mind at this level cannot accept this. It believes that the problem is a lack of information, lack of analysis, lack of clarity. So it continues to think, study, dissect. It turns life into a problem to be solved. And the more it thinks, the further it distances itself from direct experience. There is a neurological phenomenon that explains this perfectly. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network. A neural network that is active when you are not focused on anything specific. It is the inner voice that never stops. The one that keeps telling stories about who you are, what you need, what went wrong, what could go right. When this network is very active, you are not living. You are narrating, commenting, judging, planning. Life becomes a script that is constantly being rewritten in your head. And here's the problem. At this level, you confuse this constant narration with consciousness. You think that thinking about life means being present in it, but it's exactly the opposite. The more you think, the less you are really here. This manifests itself in very concrete ways. You are in a conversation, but half of your attention is analyzing the conversation. You are in a meaningful moment, but you are already thinking about how you will tell someone about this moment later. You feel something intense, but you immediately try to understand why you are feeling it, categorizing the emotion before you really allow it. The mind becomes an interpretation machine, and interpretation creates distance. There is something else that happens here, something that goes unnoticed by most. Identity begins to solidify around the intellect. I am someone who understands things. I am rational. I don't get carried away by emotions. I think before I act. And that becomes ahma, a way to feel superior to those who are still stuck at the previous levels, those who react out of fear, those who are dominated by emotions, those who cannot see their own patterns. There is a quiet pride at this level, a pride in being conscious, in having worked on oneself, in being able to analyze complex situations. And that pride, however subtle, is just the reformed ego. Now it doesn't need emotional validation. It has something better, intellectual validation. And then you meet these people who speak with surgical precision about profound concepts, who can dissect any emotional situation with impressive clarity, who know psychological theories, philosophical frameworks, behavioral models, people who seem to have reached a higher level of understanding. But when you look at their lives, something is missing. There is little lightness, little spontaneity, little risk. Because the intellect, however brilliant, has one primary function: to protect. And protection, taken to the extreme, becomes isolation. Perennial philosophy, that tradition that runs through all contemplative cultures, makes a fundamental distinction. There is knowledge about, and there is direct knowledge. You can know everything about water. You can study its chemical composition, its properties, its importance. But that doesn't quench your thirst. To quench your thirst, you need to drink. And the rational mind loves to study water, but it often forgets to drink. Think about how many times you have understood perfectly what you needed to do but didn't do it. How many times you knew you were sabotaging yourself but continued anyway. How many times you were absolutely clear about a destructive pattern but repeated it anyway. This is not a lack of intelligence. It is evidence that intellect alone does not have the power to transform. It can enlighten, it can explain, it can map, but it cannot change. Because change happens on another level, a level that thought cannot reach. But here is the tragedy of this level. It feels like the top. The mind looks back and sees how much it has evolved. It has left the animal reactivity of the first level. It has escaped the emotional chaos of the second. Now it thinks, analyzes, understands. It seems to be the peak of human consciousness. And that is exactly why so many get stuck here. Because when you believe you have reached the top, you stop climbing. And the rational mind is very good at justifying why it doesn't need to go further. Mystical states are illusions. Spirituality is just misunderstood psychology. Deep emotions are brain chemistry. Transcendence is a vague concept. All of this may be true on some level. But using partial truths to avoid greater truths is the most sophisticated form of denial. And so life goes on. Functional, controlled, understood. But something remains missing. There is a subtle dryness. A feeling that, despite all the accumulated knowledge, existence still doesn't make sense in a way that really matters. Because the mind can answer many questions, but it cannot answer the only questions that really keep you awake at night. Why am I here? What really matters? What happens when everything I've built disappears? These are not intellectual questions. They are existential questions. And they are not resolved with more thinking. They are resolved with a fundamental change in the way we perceive. But for that change to happen, something needs to break. The intellect needs to find its own limits. It needs to encounter something it cannot explain, control, or categorize. Something that dismantles the fortress it has spent so much time building. And usually this breaking point does not come through more study. It does not come through more analysis. It comes through something the mind cannot process. A loss that makes no sense. A love that destroys all defenses. A suffering so deep that it cannot be explained. Or sometimes it comes through something even simpler. Exhaustion from thinking too much. The fatigue of carrying that weight. The silent realization that life is slipping away while you try to understand it. And it is at that moment, when the intellect finally relaxes its control, that something completely different can emerge. Not something thought out, not something analyzed, but something felt. Something that doesn't need words to be real. Something that comes from the heart. There are moments in life that the mind cannot process. Moments when all explanations, all analyses, all carefully constructed defenses simply fall apart. Sometimes it's a loss, sometimes it's an encounter, sometimes it's just a moment. Looking at someone's face, or at the sky at sunset, or at your own hands, where something inside you breaks, and what enters through that crack is not thought. It is something prior to thought, something you've spent so much time avoiding that you almost forgot it existed. It is feeling. Not analyzing the feeling, not categorizing the emotion, just feeling. And when that happens, when the heart finally dismantles what the mind has built, you realize something disturbing. You weren't really alive. You were managing life, managing emotions, controlling variables, but you weren't present. Not really. This is the fourth level of consciousness, compassionate awareness. And it doesn't come as an intellectual achievement. It comes as surrender. Here, something changes radically in the way you experience the world. The walls that separated you from others begin to thin. When someone suffers, you don't just understand the suffering, you feel it. Not because you decided to be empathetic, not because you read about compassion, but because the boundary between what is yours and what belongs to others has begun to dissolve. And that's not comfortable. In fact, it's extremely vulnerable. Because when you feel the world this way, you can no longer protect yourself from it. You can no longer watch the suffering of others with analytical detachment. You can no longer rationalize why certain problems aren't yours, everything becomes yours, because you begin to realize that there is no real separation, that the pain of others is your pain, that the joy of others is your joy, that everything is interconnected in a way that the intellect has never been able to capture. In contemplative traditions, especially in Buddhism, there is a concept called bodhicitta, literally, awakened heart, or mind of enlightenment. It's not about being nice. It's not about doing the right thing. It's about a shift in the structure of perception. It's when the heart ceases to be just the organ that feels your emotions and becomes something greater, a space where every experience can exist without needing to be defended, explained, or resolved. Think about how you normally deal with difficult emotions. When deep sadness, intense fear, uncontrollable anger arise, what is the impulse? To run away, to explain, to justify, to resolve, to do anything to make the feeling go away quickly, because intense emotions seem like threats, and threats need to be neutralized. But at the fourth level, something different happens. Emotions arise, and you simply allow them. Not because you're a masochist, not because you think suffering is noble, but because you realize that emotions are not problems. They are just movements of energy. And when you stop resisting, they flow, they pass, they transform. What's more, you realize that you don't have to identify with them. You can feel anger without being an angry person. You can feel fear without being a coward. You can feel sadness without being a victim. Emotions pass through you, but they don't define you. This is freedom of a completely different kind. It's not the freedom to not feel. It's the freedom to feel everything without being overwhelmed by anything. But perhaps the most profound change at this level is the end of the need to defend the self. At the previous levels, there is always something to protect. At the first level, it is physical survival. At the second, it is emotional integrity. At the third, it is intellectual identity. There is always a self that needs to be right, to be validated, to maintain control. Here, that self begins to lose its urgency, not because you become a better person, but because you realize that this self, this coherent story about who you are, was never as solid as it seemed. It was always fluid. It was always a construct. A useful narrative perhaps, but not an absolute truth. And when you stop defending a story, something extraordinary happens. You become available to other people, available to experiences that once seemed threatening, available to life as it is, not as you need it to be. There is fascinating research on what happens in the brain during deep states of compassion. Neuroscientists have studied advanced meditators, people who have spent thousands of hours cultivating this kind of awareness, and discovered something remarkable. Activity in the default mode network, the neural network responsible for the constant narration of the I, decreases dramatically. It's not that the person loses their sense of self. It's that this sense becomes less rigid, less defensive, less centralized. It's as if the I expands to include much more than before. And here's what that means in practice. Relationships change, not because you try to be a better person, but because you stop reacting from old wounds. You stop projecting. You stop interpreting every gesture as a threat or validation. You simply see people as they are, with all their contradictions, all their flaws, all their messy and beautiful humanity. And when you see them this way, judging becomes almost impossible, because you recognize in each person the same struggle you have experienced, the same desperate search for security, the same fear disguised as control, the same loneliness hidden behind masks. This does not mean accepting everything. It does not mean having no limits. But it does mean that even when you need to distance yourself from someone, even when you need to say no, even when you need to protect your peace, you do so without carrying hatred, without needing to turn the other person into a villain to justify your choice. And perhaps for the first time you understand what it means to forgive, not as a noble gesture, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural consequence of seeing clearly. Because when you really see, when you understand the invisible forces that move people, the fears that control them, the wounds they carry, forgiving is no longer an effort, it is simply recognition. But this level is not permanent. No one lives here all the time. There are days when you wake up and your heart is open and everything flows with a surreal lightness. And there are days when you wake up and all your defenses are back and you wonder if what you felt before was real or just your imagination. And that's okay, because this level isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to let go, willing to feel, willing not to know. And if you're reading this now and something inside you recognizes this possibility, if there's a part of you that feels you've touched it before, even if briefly, even if it seemed fleeting, then you know there's something beyond the mind, something that can't be thought, only experienced. And if you want to continue exploring this, if you want to learn to inhabit this space more consistently, If you want this channel to be a companion on this journey, consider subscribing, not as a consumer of content, but as someone who is seriously committed to this awakening. Because the next videos go deeper and deeper, and you will need more than curiosity to keep up. But even the awakened heart has its limits, because there is still a you who awakens. There is still someone feeling compassion. There is still an observer, however subtle, observing the experience. And then an inevitable question arises. Is it possible to go beyond that? Is there a level where even the observer disappears? There is a type of experience that, when it happens, cannot be put into words. Not because it is ineffable in the mystical sense, but because language was made to describe separations. Subject and object, me and you, inside and outside. And this experience happens precisely when these separations collapse. Most people never touch this, not because they are incapable, but because the previous levels, survival, emotion, reason, even compassion, all operate within a fundamental premise. There is an I experiencing something other. There is a center, a point of view, an observer looking at the world. And then, in certain rare moments, through deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, states of extreme flow, or simply by accident, that premise dissolves, and what remains is not emptiness. It is fullness, but a fullness without a center, a consciousness without a subject. This is the fifth level, cosmic consciousness. And it's not about believing that we are all one. It's about directly experiencing that there never was any separation. It's hard to describe without sounding absurd, but imagine waking up and, for a moment, there being no distance between you and what you see. The tree outside is not something you observe. It is something you are. The sound of a bird does not enter your ears. It happens within the same consciousness you call you. There is no boundary. There is no inside or outside. There is only an experience happening. And in that state, the question, who am I, loses all meaning. Because there is no one separate enough to ask that question. There is only the universe experiencing itself through this particular point of view. And this point of view is no more special or more real than any other. Neuroscientists who study advanced meditators, people who have devoted decades to contemplative practice, have observed something remarkable during these states. The brain activity associated with the sense of self, that constant internal narration of I, practically disappears. And what practitioners report is unanimous. It's not that they cease to exist, it's that they become everything, not as a metaphor, as a literal experience. And when that happens, certain things that once seemed absolutely true reveal themselves to be illusions. The feeling of being separate from the world, the belief that you are inside your body looking out, the idea that your consciousness is yours, private, isolated, all of this dissolves. And what remains is something that has always been here, but that you never noticed because you were too busy being someone. There is a phrase in the Hindu tradition, specifically in the Upanishads, contemplative texts that are thousands of years old, that attempts to capture this. Tattvamasi. You are that. Not you are part of that. Not you are connected to that. But you are that. The distinction between you and the cosmos is illusory. It always has been. And perennial philosophy, that stream of wisdom that runs through all serious contemplative traditions, from Buddhism to Sufism, from Taoism to Christian mysticism, all converge on this same point. There is a level of consciousness where multiplicity reveals itself as unity, where the sense of being a separate individual reveals itself as just a temporary perspective within something infinitely greater. But here's something important. This is not a belief. It's not philosophy. It's not pretty poetry. Those who experience this don't believe they are the universe. They know it. Just as you don't believe you are feeling hungry, you simply know it. And that changes everything. Because when you know, at the most fundamental level possible, that there is no real separation, the fear of death changes in quality. It doesn't necessarily disappear, but it loses that visceral urgency. Because what is going to die? The body? Yes. The personality? Also. But the consciousness that observes through this body, this personality, that's not going anywhere. Because it was never yours to begin with. It is what everything is made of. Relationships also change. Not because you stop caring, but because you realize that when you look into someone's eyes, you are not looking at another person. You are looking at another expression of the same consciousness. It is the universe looking at itself through two temporary points of view. And then even compassion, that fourth level so deep, becomes something even more direct. It's no longer about feeling the other's pain. It's recognizing that there is no other. The pain that seems to be there is happening within the same consciousness that feels this pain here. It's all one experience unfolding. But, and this is a crucial but, almost no one stays here. These states are, for the vast majority of people, glimpses, temporary openings. windows that open for a moment and then close. And when they close, when you return to ordinary consciousness, something strange happens. Part of you knows that it was real, perhaps the most real thing you have ever experienced. But the mind, that insistent narrator, begins to do what it does best: doubt, interpret, categorize. It was just a neurological experience. It was just an altered state. It doesn't mean anything. And that doubt is in itself a return to separation, because now there is again an I trying to understand an experience, a subject analyzing an object. Duality has returned. Many people who reach this level become obsessed with returning. They want to feel it again. They want to live there permanently. And this obsession can become a new prison, a spiritual quest that, ironically, reinforces the I that needs to disappear for the state to happen. And this is where the danger of spiritual bypassing arises, using transcendent experiences as an excuse not to deal with the psychological work at the previous levels. We are all one, so why resolve this trauma? Everything is consciousness, so why worry about relationships? The self is an illusion, so why work on my patterns? But the truth is, you can have glimpses of the fifth level and still be completely messed up in the first three. And unless you integrate, unless you bring what you learned up there back down here, the experience becomes just another story the ego tells about itself. I had an experience of unity. I saw beyond the veil. I understood. Look, even the I has crept back in. And so the question becomes, is it possible to go beyond that? Beyond even those glimpses? Beyond the experience of unity? Because as long as there is someone experiencing unity, there is still duality. There is still an observer observing. Is there a sixth level? A level where even the observer dissolves, where there is no one seeking, no one experiencing, no one coming back to tell the story. There is something deeply ironic about the journey through the levels of consciousness. The further you go, the more you realize there is nowhere to go. The more you awaken, the more you recognize that you were never really asleep. The further you seek, the more evident it becomes that what you are looking for was never lost. And then, if you go deep enough, if you go through all the levels, all the glimpses, all the transcendent experiences, you arrive at something that shouldn't even be called a level, because calling it a level implies that it is a stage to be reached, a step to be climbed, a state to be achieved. But it's nothing like that. This is the sixth stage, non-dual consciousness. And the first thing that needs to be said about it is that there is no one to reach it. Because the moment it happens, there is no one left to experience it. This sounds like wordplay, like a meaningless mystical paradox, but it's the most accurate description possible. Because what characterizes all the previous levels, including the fifth, however high it may be, is that there is always a basic structure, someone experiencing something, a subject and an object, an observer and an observed. Even in cosmic consciousness, where boundaries dissolve and you feel one with everything, there is still a you feeling that oneness. There is still someone having the experience of non-separation. And that, however subtle, is duality. It is the last, most refined, most almost invisible form of separation. And in non-dual consciousness, even that disappears. There is no longer an I aware of being aware. There is no longer a center of experience. There is no longer someone meditating, someone awakening, someone understanding. There is only this. Whatever is happening alone. Experience without an experiencer. Consciousness without a subject. Traditions that have reached this point use strange language precisely because ordinary language does not work. In Advaita Vedanta, a branch of Hindu philosophy, they say, there is no one who becomes enlightened because there was never anyone to be in illusion. In Zen, they say, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. What changes? Nothing. Everything. It depends on who is asking, and that is precisely the point. Try to visualize this in a more concrete way, even though concreteness always fails here. Imagine that throughout your life you believed you were watching a movie. You were the viewer, the protagonist was someone else, and you were deeply involved in the plot. And then, in an inexplicable moment, you realize you are not watching the movie. You are the movie. You are the screen, the images, the projector, the darkroom. There is no separate spectator, there never was. And when this is seen, not thought, not believed, but seen directly, the search ends. Not because you found what you were looking for, but because you realized that there was never anyone looking. The whole journey, all the levels, all the practices, all the awakenings were movements within the same consciousness playing hide and seek with itself. And this is not nihilistic. It is not empty in the depressive sense. It is empty in the sense that there is no fixed substance, no solid I, no permanent entity that you can point to and say, this is me. But this emptiness is full of experience, full of life, full of everything that is happening now. only now it belongs to no one. In the Dzogchen tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, there is a teaching called Rigpa, primordial awareness or naked awareness. They say that Rigpa has always been here, that you have never strayed from it, that all levels of practice, all efforts at meditation, all deep insights don't take you to Rigpa. They just remove the layers of concepts that made you believe you were separate from it. It's like cleaning a window that has always been transparent, but you covered it with so much thinking, so much searching, so much history about yourself that you forgot you could see through it. And here's what that means in practice, or rather, what those rare individuals who seem to inhabit it report. Life goes on, emotions arise, thoughts appear, decisions are made, relationships happen, but there is no longer anyone identifying with any of it. There is no longer an I that has these experiences. There is only the flow of life unfolding. And paradoxically, this does not make the person apathetic or disconnected. In fact, the opposite seems to happen. Without the weight of a me to be protected, defended, validated, the response to the world becomes more direct, more spontaneous, more alive, because there is no longer anyone in the way between what arises and the response. It's like water. Water doesn't decide how to flow. It doesn't think about the path. It simply responds to the shape of the terrain. And somehow, when there is no longer a rigid I trying to control everything, life flows like that. But, and this is perhaps the most important but of all, this is extremely rare, not because it's impossible, but because the I is incredibly persistent. It constantly reforms itself. Even after profound insights, even after experiences of non-duality, the ego returns, reformulated perhaps, more subtle, but still there. And sometimes it comes back disguised as spirituality. I have reached the non-dual state. I have seen the ultimate truth. I am enlightened. See? The I has crept back in, and now it has an even better story to tell about itself. That is why genuine masters of contemplative traditions are so emphatic. There is nothing to achieve, no one to become, no special state to attain, because all these goals presuppose a self that isn't there yet, and that self is exactly what needs to be seen as an illusion. But seeing this, really seeing it, not just understanding it intellectually, is extremely rare. Most people who say they have seen it are still operating from a subtle sense of self. There is still someone there who saw, and that someone, however refined, is still a form of separation. So what to do with this? How to relate to a level of consciousness that, by definition, cannot be achieved by effort? The honest answer is, you do nothing, because you doing something is exactly the problem. Effort reinforces the doer. The search reinforces the seeker. And as long as there is a seeker, what he seeks will remain hidden, not because it is far away, but because he is looking with the wrong eyes. But here's the thing, you also can't do nothing as a strategy, because not doing with the intention of achieving is just another form of doing. It's the ego trying to be clever. It's a logical dead end, an unsolvable paradox. And maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe the I needs to exhaust itself completely in the attempt to achieve something it can never achieve, until one day, without warning, without clear reason, it simply relaxes. And in that relaxation, with no one trying, no one seeking, something that has always been here becomes obvious. But even that cannot be turned into a technique, because the moment you try to relax so that it happens, you have again created a doer with an agenda. It's frustrating. It's paradoxical. It's probably the hardest thing to communicate in any human language. And yet, there is something deeply liberating about it. Because if there is nothing to achieve, then there is no way to fail. If there is no one to enlighten, then there is no one living in darkness. If everything is already consciousness unfolding, then even this moment, with all its imperfections, with all its apparent suffering, with all its confusion, is exactly what it needs to be. Not as resignation, not as passive acceptance, but as a direct recognition that this, exactly what is happening right now, is already complete. It is already whole. It is already what all levels point to. And then the final question arises, the simplest and most impossible. What do you do with this? How do you live knowing that these levels exist, but that most mornings you still wake up in the first one? Here's the truth that no one wants to hear. You don't stay at the top. Even the most advanced masters, those who have devoted entire decades to contemplative practice, those who have had profound and irreversible insights into the nature of consciousness, even they come back. They return to the most basic levels. They return to fear. They return to reactivity. They return to the ego. The difference is what they do when they return. Because consciousness is not a ladder that you climb once and remain at the top. It's more like a spiral. You climb, you gain perspective, you glimpse something beyond, and then life pulls you back. A bad day, an unexpected loss, a conflict that activates all your old wounds. And suddenly you're back at the first level, reacting as if your life depended on an argument about who's going to wash the dishes. And there's something deeply humiliating about that, especially if you've already touched the higher levels. If you've ever felt the dissolution of boundaries, if you've ever experienced boundless compassion, if you've ever glimpsed non-dual consciousness, returning to anxiety about money, to resentment in relationships, to the fear of not being enough, it feels like a failure. It feels like proof that you haven't evolved at all. But it's not. It's simply how consciousness works. It expands and contracts. It opens and closes. It awakens and falls asleep. And that cycle is not a problem. It is the very nature of human experience. The problem starts when you use glimpses of higher levels to avoid the work of lower levels. When you say we are all one, so you don't have to deal with the fact that you're angry at someone specific. When you say everything is an illusion, so you don't have to feel the real pain going through your chest. When you use spirituality as anesthesia. That's what they call spiritual bypassing. And it's incredibly common, because the higher levels are tempting. They're beautiful. They make you feel special, evolved, beyond mundane problems. And it's much more seductive to float around in abstractions about cosmic consciousness than to deal with the fact that you still treat people badly when you're afraid. But here's what genuine masters understand. The real work isn't about reaching higher states. It's about integration. It's about taking what you saw up there and bringing it back down here. It's about meeting fear, anger, insecurity, all those patterns from the first and second levels, and meeting them with the awareness you've developed in the higher levels, not to eliminate them, not to transcend them permanently, but to relate to them differently. Imagine this. You feel anger rising. At the first level, you simply react. You explode, attack, defend. At the second level, you identify with the anger. I'm an angry person. This is terrible. I need to fix this. At the third level, you analyze the anger. This comes from a childhood wound. It makes sense that I feel this way. At the fourth level, you allow the anger with compassion. This is just energy moving. I can feel it without acting on it. Do you see the difference? It's not that anger disappears at the higher levels. It's that you learn to inhabit it without being possessed by it. And that changes everything. Because life never stops challenging you. No matter how awake you are, no matter how many profound insights you've had, the world keeps testing you. Relationships remain difficult. Losses remain painful. Uncertainty remains uncomfortable. And you will repeatedly find yourself falling back into old patterns. And that's okay. It's not a failure. It's just life happening. The question is, when you fall, do you notice? When you're back in survival mode, in reactive mode, in ego mode, is there a part of you that sees it happening? Or are you completely identified with it? Because that ability to notice, even in the midst of chaos, even in the midst of reactivity, is what really matters. It's not about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and knowing that you're afraid. It's not about not reacting. It's about reacting and 2 minutes later realizing, oh, there I go again. And with that realization, something changes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but little by little, you become less stuck. The patterns still happen, but they last less. Identification still occurs, but you let go faster. And little by little, almost without noticing, you spend more time in the higher levels and less time in the lower ones. Not because you've become perfect, but because you've become a present. You've developed the ability to see what's happening as it's happening. And that presence, that witnessing awareness, is what really liberates. And here's something crucial. This presence doesn't reject any level. It doesn't say the first level is bad, the sixth is good. It recognizes that all levels have their place. That even survival fear, even emotional reactivity, even the ego, they all serve a function. And when they are seen clearly, when they are inhabited with awareness, they cease to be prisons. They become just experiences, passing, as everything passes. So maybe the real question isn't, how do I reach the higher levels? But rather, how do I inhabit each level with presence? How do I remain conscious no matter where I am? And the answer is simple, though not easy. You practice, not in the sense of complex meditative techniques, although they can help, but in the sense of returning, repeatedly, to awareness of the present moment, of noticing when you are lost in thought, of feeling when you are identified with an emotion, of realizing when the ego is running the show, and then gently, always gently, you let go. Not because letting go is the spiritual thing to do, but because holding on hurts, and little by little, you learn that you can let go faster, that you can return faster, that you can inhabit life with more lightness, even when it is heavy. And maybe eventually you realize that it was never about reaching a specific level. It was always about waking up to the fact that you are already whole, you are already complete, you are already everything you need to be. not because you've arrived somewhere, but because you never left. And now, at the end of this journey through the levels of consciousness, you're probably asking yourself, what now? What do I do with this? And the most honest answer I can give you is, you live. You keep living, but perhaps with a little more attention, a little more compassion, a little more space for whatever is happening. You don't have to become a monk. You don't have to abandon your life. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to see. See the patterns, see the prisons, see the possibilities. And if something in this video touched you, if something here resonated in a way you didn't expect, then keep going, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep awakening. Because that's the work. It's not about reaching a final destination. It's about being more and more present on the path. So here's my question for you. At which of these levels do you find yourself spending most of your time? And what does that reveal about where you really are? Think about it, feel it. And if you want to continue this journey, watch the next videos on the channel. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.